All right, and welcome to Inside the Cannabis Operator Playbook. What actually happens after you launch your cannabis business? Hosted by our good friends here at Cogent Law and those of us here at Cannaspire. Thank you all for joining us today. And if we want to go ahead and just get into some brief introductions and let everyone know who's here on the team today. While people are filing in, I'll kick it off. My name is Warren Harris. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer at Cannaspire. Basically, I've been helping people with multi-state licensing and compliance systems, helping them with operational readiness, and then advisory services, vendors to choose, good choices for how to run your business. And we've been doing this for all cannabis businesses, so cultivation, manufacturing, dispensaries, you name it. We do this nationally, and really my background is as an 18-year cultivator, and I've done over, probably 30 states applications at this point. Most recently, I worked with Big Island Grown in Hawaii. They were a vertically integrated medical licensee with a 60,000 square foot clean room facility, and that was how I cut my teeth into the licensed compliance world. So very pleased to have you all on today. Beck, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Warren. I'm Beck Selman, Director of Compliance for Cannaspire. I was a small-scale cultivator that went into a biology background, went to Florida Atlantic for biology, went into food manufacturing, and I kind of became an expert in food safety, PCQI, HACCP, SQF, GMP certifications, working in those food safe facilities and doing manufacturing of processed cheese and bottled water. I've been with Cannaspire for over 3 years now, licensing companies in New Jersey, New York, Minnesota, all across the East Coast. And we are very excited to be here and hopefully can answer some of your questions about, what are the pitfalls and challenges of getting started in a new operation once you're already licensed. Licensing can be the easy part sometimes.
So, who are Cannaspire, right? So, we are an international end-to-end cannabis and psilocybin consulting firm. We help people with business plans to get their financial pro forma up. We do their business license application. And then, of course, once they're up and licensed, we help them do their operational readiness and then all of their in-house compliance on a fractional basis. We've worked with small to large multi-state operators, as well as mom and pop businesses just trying to get their toe into the industry. I tell all of my clients there is always room on the top shelf in the cannabis industry. So if you're good, you will survive. And then, of course, we have connections across the industry, right? So designers to help get your facility put together, staffing, marketing, vendors for all of your equipment and resources. And then we are a certified woman-owned business, and we do like to give back a portion of our profits to social equity candidates and help those that really need it in the cannabis industry. So very pleased to have you all here and to speak to you all today.
And good morning. I think good morning for everybody. My name is Suehiko Ono. I'm a partner at Cogent Law, and my personal practice is focused in New York, but offer a fractional general counsel service for New York operators, but also New Jersey, California. We have partners in California, and we can provide services there, Illinois, Pennsylvania, et cetera. I personally got my start in the law way back when as a tax attorney. So I sort of think of the world through that lens, which obviously is very helpful in this world. But then really kind of took some turns as we do, and really was on the operator side for quite some time. I started a cultivation facility in Massachusetts in 2018. And then I moved on and worked for a vertically integrated operator, one of the largest in New York, and fulfilled several roles there, including a general manager. So really have a sort of insider operator view of this, including some of the GMP certification standards and the operational and compliance side of things. But the service I provide and that we at Cogent here provide is really a very broad spectrum across, capital raise and structuring, tax planning, all of the various contracts that are involved, executive agreements, of course, but management services contracts, the tolling, the brand licensing, things of that nature. So, very much kind of look at this from the operator side of the law. So happy to be here and talk about this subject.
Thanks, Suehiko. Great to have. Thanks for having us on, and we're excited to hear about your inside experience. Having that legal knowledge and that operator knowledge is really valuable. Really valuable. We do a really good job at Cannaspire. We interpret the regulations for each state. We always tell our clients, go to your attorney, have them write up your operating agreements, work with them. We can interpret the cannabis law really well, but there's a lot of other laws in the state with labor and, and things that you really want to work with an attorney to make sure that you're in line with those laws and not getting yourself in trouble at all. So we love working with attorneys like that.
That's a good segue into our topic for today of, how to get operational, what happens once a company is open and licensed, and how to keep going. And I mean, Beck, you're hitting the nail on the head, right? We've seen a lot of operators that they get started with sort of a bad cap table or a bad partnership agreement. And this is where, starting with somebody like Suehiko on your team, that really is savvy, has already been through the rodeo of the cannabis industry and has seen sort of how these partnerships, shake out over time, what's a good deal and what's a bad deal. It can save you a lot of headache down the line, if you ever want to sell your shares, if you ever want to sell your business to a larger operator, or if you just want to consolidate and own it all yourself and not have all of these other members, basically taking a piece of the pie. So I feel like that's, good advice. Get set up right at the beginning because it will save you money down the line, right? So from there, where do we want to start, Suehiko, in terms of how do we get people running and help them save money?
Well, I think you actually touched on some of the really important aspects of this, right? And when you're first starting up, everybody is extremely excited, right? And very optimistic. And there's good reason to be, right? There's an enormous amount of opportunity. However, there are some very specific challenges that are in a lot of regards unique to cannabis, right? So you've got the big one, which is this tension between federal and state law. And then, of course, downstream of there, right at the top is the 280E, which, maybe we can talk about this, maybe not. But to be very clear, for recreational operators, that still is very much in effect. If you're medical, right, that has changed very recently, but it's still something you have to be aware of. And from there, how you structure the entities. And that's where you start to also get into the specifics of the state frameworks, right? In terms of limitations on control and how many licenses can be owned. And all of those things really come into play as you're forming and structuring the entity, where again, everyone is always very optimistic, and you enter into these partnerships and you enter into these agreements and you bring in capital, and everyone is kind of thinking about best case scenario. But our job here really, from the sort of legal counsel and compliance side, is to really be able to help you identify the risks that come in the near term and the long term, right? And preparing for that in the structuring and the planning.
Well, and this is where yeah, go ahead, Beck.
Yeah, what kind of mistakes do you see with those operating agreements? We've run into a few clients with ownership disputes. We always recommend, go to an attorney, have them write up your operating agreements. Unless you're a single member operating agreement, then you might be able to get away with a template and do it yourself, right? But definitely when there's multiple owners involved, you can't do that yourself. That's what we always suggest. So.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Yeah, so to your point, really a lot of those governance issues, right? And so basically, being very clear within the operating agreement how the governance works, and then what happens, how do you deal with disputes when you don't agree? And those are two glaring omissions that I see over and over again. I see, you see more and more a lot of the sort of chat GPT AI agreements, which can be a good baseline to be fair. But when they leave out these critical pieces, and again to your point, Beck, the governance and disputes, right? How does the operating agreement handle those things? Critical.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then who's investing what, and is seems like you know another point of contention. There's
Yeah,
a couple of partners might have a little money, and then they're seeking outside investment, and money comes in, and it's like who owns what.
that's exactly right.
Yeah, those sort
Well,
of things.
in any one of these topics, we could talk for hours, but
Yeah,
I'll leave it at this. But again,
yeah,
back to the tax planning piece of this, is one of the things you see
mhm,
is when you have interest in an entity, whether it's stock or membership interest in an LLC or whatever the case may be, depending on what you contribute, when, and what you get in return, there could be significant tax consequences with all of that. So, quite recently, I saw there was a client of mine who was essentially getting compensation in the form of interest, and they didn't quite understand what that meant. But the consequences of that was that the IRS considered them as seeing ordinary income and had to pay taxes on that, right? So, just those types of kind of downstream challenges that all kind of come from the early stage structuring are very important to consider.
yeah, definitely. Like, what are the implications of C corp versus S corp, and how you structure that
Yeah.
can really impact how much taxes you pay, even though you haven't made any money on it. Still pay
Yep.
taxes if you don't set that up
Yep.
right. Um,
Yeah, I mean, just to move into sort of the pitfalls, and you hit on this, Suehiko, is the GMP in New York. And then like
Yeah.
Florida requires it also. And as 280 shifts, right, which there are rumors that they're coming for adult use this summer. I, these are rumors, the federal government moves very slowly. And so whether or not that actually happens, I don't know. But the point is that when the tax law changes and you can start writing things off, well, liability starts to come along also because now the feds are involved in your game. So this is where we see sort of New York and Florida as being prescient and ahead of the market by requiring GMP because currently it's pretty much in every other major manufacturing industry. And to the point, with this state by state patchwork of laws, it's only a matter of time before a regulator in New York misses that the chocolate bar that was manufactured had contact with peanuts and the operator didn't, disclose that. Somebody with a peanut allergy eats it, gets sick, and dies, right? So this is what GMP and the FDA are existent for, to prevent these sort of things from happening. And so as the federal government creeps in, this is going to be one of those make or break things for companies, right? Is whether or not you even took the effort to put pre-GMP into your plan, right? Because the distance of that gap between you being able to close GMP and get it certified is basically whether or not you're going to keep your license, right? So in New York, you have 1 year post licensure or excuse me, post processing activities, which is an important distinction, right? So when did
Yep.
you start doing processing to get your GMP? And in which case, it's very hard to turn an old farm building, with
With
holes and issues in it into a clean, sealed IPM, hand washed, good manufacturing practice area. So again, this is one of those things when you're in the beginning, starting your license and thinking ahead, you need to plan for this financially because if the feds come in 2 years, 3 years, it could completely kill your license.
That's right.
yeah, very important to build your processing facility out with those good manufacturing practices in mind. I mean, it's just it's necessary to create a safe product for your consumers and reduce your liability. Even if you don't go through the certification, just familiarize yourself with what that means in terms of how you build your facility out. Are your walls and your ceilings and your floors all cleanable? Are all your surfaces, your food contact surfaces, are they all stainless or some food safe material? Do you have the hand washing sink and all that maintained? Do you have proper sanitation and proper records of sanitation? If somebody came back and said they got sick off your product, that shouldn't happen because there's a final testing and everybody goes through that final testing. That's your real critical control point in most cannabis process products. But, say somebody came back and did say they got sick on it, you want to have those records that prove that you cleaned that machine before it was put into use, and that everything was sanitary before it went out. So it's a liability standpoint. So and then it's going to be law in eventually. It's we're seeing it state by state later, as they require it. New York requires it, Florida requires it, and it's just a matter of time with the federal changes that other states are going to require that, because it's an FDA it's an FDA required thing for if you're making food, and it's going out to the masses. So very
Exactly
important.
right. Yeah. And setting the stage, right? I mean, kind of piggybacking off what you're saying, setting the stage for this transition, right, to the rescheduling. If you are getting to the correct GMP practices sooner, then it's going to be much easier to make that transition if you do. But and one of the things that I think a lot of operators don't consider, in a lot of ways, right? Cannabis industry is not inherently terribly complicated. So what I mean is, it's agriculture and manufacturing. Now, manufacturing is where it starts to get a little more complicated. And I think this is where a lot of operators really don't quite anticipate the drag and the burden and the cost of the compliance. But what they also don't recognize is that essentially the entire business model is downstream of good compliance. So what I mean is this: manufacturing ultimately, right, as this as this industry matures, the margins continue to shrink, and we see that over and over. It's a very large market, but the margins are slim. This is agriculture and manufacturing. Well, what does that mean? It means that if you don't know where every piece of package is, where all of your raw materials are, where you are in the production process, if you don't have very, very good tracking of all of your inventory, then you're flying blind, and you just simply cannot operate a business like this. And then even further downstream, so you've got the compliance layer, right, and the liability that Beck and Warren just identified. Then you've got the operational sort of business intelligence side of it. But then you also have all of the contracts and agreements. So if I'm a manufacturer and I'm producing through a manufacturing tolling brand licensing agreement, and I cannot keep track of my commercial partners' inventory, packaging, then that is just recipe for disaster and breakdown in the relationship. So it's such a critical piece of this.
Absolutely.
And that's a good point. So like when we're talking about what actually happens after you launch, right? So you've won your license, you've got it, you built your facility, you've got all your cameras and your equipment in there, right? The inspector now says, "Great, go forth, grow cannabis, manufacture cannabis, sell cannabis, whatever it is that you're licensed to do." I don't think people realize that from there are so many SOPs, so many, employee handbook policies that are not required by the state, right? So the state in your application process, they'll ask you for labeling and packaging, they'll ask you for sanitation, they'll ask you for a lot of these basic things. They won't ask you for cash handling. They won't ask you for, training verification, and which this is one of the ones that I know compliance officers like myself go crazy chasing around employees trying to make sure they've all gotten their training. And this is where you just need to have your GMs, your managers with that training clipboard right near them and just signing off because, hey, you just sat down and showed somebody how to twist the end of the pre-rolls and put it into the tube. That was training. Mark it down. Make sure they're getting that time. when you find something that's out of place. Well, these are the SOPs that are above and beyond what the state requires. You go down your checklist and you go, oh, Timmy, the grow tech didn't package this stuff correctly. Sit them down, show them how to do it in corrective, and then record all of that, right? Because this is, to Beck's point, to Suehiko's point, your liability. It shows that you said, we had this guy on the line that wasn't doing the work properly. We took the time to retrain him. And then when he did it two, three times more, well, we've got a disciplinary policy. We let him go because it was a risk to our company, right? So this is where just thinking logistically, what actually happens after we launch. Well, the first thing we do is build out this compliance system that Suehiko is describing to try to anticipate these areas of gap, right?
Yeah, that's a big thing that we do at Cannaspire, right? Is writing those SOPs, and those SOPs will give you, as an operator, everything you need to know out of the law, out of the regulations for your state. And again, this doesn't cover all the regulations outside of cannabis. That's where do need a lawyer on your team. But as far as the state regulations go on how to operate your cannabis business, Cannaspire puts those regulations and policies into the operating procedures for your manufacturing or cultivation or dispensary. Now, making sure your employees really thoroughly understand that is what Warren's getting at, is the training bit. And that's where a lot of people do fail. Everybody skims over the SOPs, signs off, says they know them all. Well, that's a lot of regulations, go over them again, at least annually. But really make sure people test people on that knowledge and make sure they really know those regulations, because that can get you into trouble with the state. The inspector comes in and they like to ask those employees, they like to find somebody that they know is not going to know the answer to something, and they'll ask them the question that they don't know. And then it's like, hey, you're using a cleaning chemical here. Can you show me the SDS for that, the safety data sheet for that chemical? And the employee says, what's an SDS? You're not looking good right there, because immediately the inspector knows that your employee does not know the proper PPE or the proper first aid for that chemical. And what the safety concerns are. Is it going to cause blindness, going to burn my skin, or is it flammable? What you need, employees need to know those things and where to find that information.
Yeah. And again, always two sides of that coin, right? So you've got the sort of compliance, the state required aspects, you've got the liability protection, and then again, just operations, making a business that actually is functional. And so the SOPs are not just, a book that you put in a closet and collects dust, right? These are living documents. And, again, I think there's always this enormous rush to get going and to hire people, and people just completely, I see this over and over as operators in this mad rush. They don't carefully screen employees. They don't have probationary periods and training. They don't have continuous reinvestment into making sure that every employee knows what their role is and how to perform their tasks. And then treating these SOPs like living documents, right? Not like, paperweights. So, really kind of integrating these, and I can't stress this enough. I mean, cannabis is really ultimately, it is a business, compliance. I mean, it is a compliance centered business. And if you don't get those pieces into the DNA of the business, then you're going to have hiccups. And whether you pay for it on the front end or you pay for it on the back end is going to be the choice. And even again, on the employee side. So you've got the operational side. You want it to operate smoothly. But, unfortunately, especially when you're starting, or fortunately, it's just kind of the nature, there's going to be turnover in employees. And if you haven't taken these steps, and if you haven't done these trainings, and you don't have a record, then that's where you open yourself up, not just to the product liability side of things, but also labor law, right? And all of those. So absolutely critical.
That's a good point, Suehiko. The employee handbook is another aspect that we write employee handbooks. but it's really something that needs to go to your lawyer afterwards to make sure it covers all those state regulations, the state laws, and it's tight and there's not loopholes because your employees are always looking for some loophole. And then you have that 90-day probationary period, and they've signed that they've read all these policies and they know what the policies are. But going state to state, those laws and those policies vary drastically. We've seen like sick pay policies come up in New Jersey and New York, or since COVID. Now they've mandated sick pay. So every state, you can't just use a template for your handbook. You really need it needs to be tight, and that's an important part of your onboarding. We do a lot of staffing and help people with that a lot, and the turnover. Depending on the industry, retail is always higher, depending on the city you're in, especially. But the turnover, unfortunately, in retail can be a little bit higher, no matter how good you are.
And there are strategies to prevent that, right? And I think this is relevant to what happens after you launch, right? So we've seen dispensaries, particularly, just a way overstaff, 20 employees on day one, and they don't even know what their volume's going to be like. Well, come back a month later, they've had to lay off, 40% of those employees. And now you've got people all through the community that are not really big fans of your shop, right? And then the other, I would say, is it's really about, turnover's a cost, right? So I worked at a dispensary in California, shout out to Spark Peace and Medicine, where in 2014, some of those people that I worked with are still there today, 12 years later, because they love their jobs, they're well treated, and their value to the company is such that, yeah, they now have 7 dispensaries throughout the Bay Area and are a fixture, right? So this is the value of having absolute rock stars on your team that do not want to leave and can raise their family. But, to Beck's point, it's a balance, right? Because you are running a business and you have to do this affordably. So salaries, all of this has to match what your actual level of revenue is. So I would say all of this comes down to, very careful business planning, having, your pro forma, and then using that, which we do pro formas for our clients all the time, but using that as a project management tool. So as you start going from capital raise into actual licensed operations, well, now you are taking your CapEx and actually getting vendor quotes and plugging them in. And you're actually going through the nitty-gritty of every single role that's going to be in there and what your personnel chart is going to look like. Because all of this translates into your costs down the line, and you just have to be, a lot of forethought needs to go into this to prevent, major bottlenecks in your business.
Definitely. Yeah, we staffing pitfalls. If Warren said overstaffing, sometimes understaffing, usually less. It can cause negative, reviews if somebody's waiting in line for too long or they're not getting proper service. The other issue we see, and this might hurt some owner operators, is we have owner operators that get licensed. And they want to run the dispensary, but they've never run a dispensary before, and that's great. But they hire a manager, and the manager is experienced and knows what they're doing, and wants to run the store in a proper and follow the regulations. And then the owner wants to run it their way, and they're the owner, and they can do whatever they want because they're the. So we get some butting heads between owners and managers. And that drives away a lot of managers. We have experience, we'll staff an experienced manager at a store, and within a couple of months, or say, I'm trying to run this store and make it legally and do the best I can for you, but you got to let me follow the regulations. You got to listen to me when I tell you that's against the regulations. Again, knowing those regulations, knowing where the laws are. If you want to run your own store and learn how to do it, hire a consultant to teach you how to do it, or hire somebody on a short-term basis. Say, hey, you got experience. I'm going to pay you premium dollars for 6 months to teach me how to run this store, and then I'm going to cut you free, and you're gone. And it's the end of the contract. That works really well for some people. And then other situations, we find really good managers, and the owner steps back and lets them run the store. and they do really well. So just something to consider there when you're getting into a new business, especially just retail. We see that a lot in retail. If you're getting into cultivation or manufacturing, um, ideally you know what you're doing already, because that's a you can hire people with the expertise, and you can hire people that say they're the best cultivator in the world, and in a year later or 2 years later you're hiring a new head cultivator because you didn't get a yield that you wanted. So we do see that a lot as well. So it's better if you want to go into that industry that you are the expert already and you can oversee that. So
Well, and I mean, that's a good segue, right? So we've talked a little about staffing and how that presents a challenge for these new businesses and, can really be a make or break for some of them as they start. Another one that I see is bottlenecks with the supply chain. And right now, Beck, I'm thinking particularly about Minnesota with two testing labs and backups for product. And so the state licensed a ton of dispensaries, and now they're all fighting each other over the very limited amount of cultivators and manufacturers. So, to sort of speak to that, first thing I would say is, if you're pre-licensure, it's not too early to start making connections with these people and saying, look, my deadline to have my facility up and running is 2 to 3 months. Please put me in the queue. And then also the squeaky wheel strategy, right? To where, I was trying to help a dispensary do their buying, and I mean, it was just ice cold, absolutely no responses, just getting the Heisman from basically everyone, right? And then just by persistence, and this is just old school sales tactics, right? Like, what happens once I'm up and running? Well, what's going to happen is you need to start beating on some doors and making some phone calls. Because if you're in Minnesota, only those that are persistent are going to actually get that product on the shelf and have a successful launch. You're paying rent, you're paying employees, you paid for all of the build out for the licensing. You've bled out potentially $500,000 or more to get this dispensary off the ground. And now you're sitting there going, oh my gosh, there's no product to sell, right? So, squeaky wheel gets the grease, and who can make a huge difference in this industry, right? So I don't know, Suehiko, if you have any experience with those sorts of scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and sort of kind of tying back some of the earlier things that you both said, right? Writing this stuff down, again, back to the compliance and the systems and the GMP and having simple things that, sound cliche and maybe overkill, org charts, right? Knowing who is responsible for what, know what the flow charts look like, right? So when you're thinking about supply chain, again, especially on the cultivation and in particular the manufacturing, if you're manufacturing more than one SKU and you don't know every single piece, every single raw material in the bill of materials, right? Your production capacity, your employees, what their roles are. It's painful to really kind of think through it on the front end, and it won't be correct, right? So remember that it will be it'll be a facsimile, it'll be an approximation, but having that roadmap so that when you're going through the supply chain and you're saying, okay, where am I getting the labels? And how many times I cannot tell you how many times I've seen it where we had a new product launch and a simple, silly, you know, a temper resistant, label that wasn't on there and you cannot ship to market. So now you're out and you got to make phone calls and pay a premium. And now you're waiting 2 weeks for the delivery. It gets, caught in the port for coming from China. You really got to have this stuff mapped out. So if you take the pain and the effort and the expense on the front end and do this stuff, then and then persistence. I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
Actually, and right on this point, I see the question in our Q&A, which I'll circle back to one of our other questions. But yeah, they find in their audits that a lot of cultivators and manufacturers do not have agreements with their suppliers that allow them to audit the supplier. And yes, we do see the same. And this is a huge vulnerability, right? is look, the food industry does this, right? They audit and have supplier approval and vendor verification processes to ensure that there's no sawdust in the wheat, right? That the food that you're getting to manufacture with is actually what they say it is and it's up to quality standards. Well, the cannabis industry is lagging, and to Suehiko's point, if you have one label supplier and it turns out you didn't order your tamper evident labels in time, well, that's a major risk, right? Like you should probably have at least two, if not three potential suppliers for anything, a first, second, and third that you are ready to. And this really goes down to like a food safety and food defense plan. Once again, going back to GMP, every other industry does this. The cannabis industry needs to start adopting these things because it's going to save you $1 down the road in going, oh my gosh, we're now 4 weeks away from launch with our new product. Why didn't we have tamper evident labels here today, right now? So,
Yeah.
forethought.
Yeah, we've seen people get tamper evident labels and they don't stick, and then they send them out to the dispensary and they're coming loose, and the dispensary's complaining. So yeah, I mean, I worked for Niagara Bottling. They make all the store brand bottled water cases of liter, bottled water, and there there was an earthquake out west in 98, I believe it was 1998. And it shut down their shipment of bottles. They were buying all their bottles to fill uh, with water. And at that point, they decided they were going to make their own bottles, and they bought an injection molding machine. And now that company has grown, exponentially, because they couldn't stand to have that bottleneck again, or that not be able to bottle their water. And they've since revolutionized the size of that packaging. So yeah, to Warren's point, and have alternate suppliers for that, agreements with your, it's important for GMP's good manufacturing practices, vendor verification, know who your vendors are they food safe? And if, especially as you grow in size and uh, I say, as I always put it, you're big enough to have a target on your back, right? Once you're making good money, then that's when you really have to be careful with that and know your vendors and really start auditing your vendors and making sure, if we stored a product in a 3PL location, we would go and check that and make sure there's no signs of rodents or any problems. Climate's good for storing that product. So yeah, very, very important to know who your vendors are, have records of all their materials and their certificates of uh, of quality for their products as well. Knowing what the packaging is made out of, knowing the ingredients that your products are being stored in. What are those turkey bags made out of? You need to have documentation of that for sure.
And just to follow up on Kevin's question, since these states that aren't under GMP,
Mm-hmm.
if the supplier pushes back, I would use my purchase power against them. I would go,
Exactly.
okay, you don't want to do this. Well, there are a million suppliers that are desperate to
Yeah.
get, I mean, I can't tell you how many packaging emails I get from people who all have the cheapest, best packaging, so that's where I would say either you're going to toe the line and help me CYA and have my compliance framework in place, or I'm going to go out and bid this out to somebody who's willing to do the work with me,
Yeah.
right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Costco's not going to buy from anybody that they won't, that's not going to let them audit their facility. And then Costco's got enough buying power where they'll come in and dictate. They say, we don't like that you're only cleaning this tank once a week. We want you to clean it every time you use it. And we got no choice but to say, sure, we're going to clean this every time we use it so we can keep selling to Costco. So yeah,
Yeah,
very
the
important.
other thing too, and so I think it's exactly right, right? It's the marketplace, right? You use your purchasing power, but you can also kind of remind them that your product before it goes to market is tested heavily, more heavily than just about any other product that any other consumer product, right? And so if there is contamination, then you will be the one economically who sort of bears that burden. And so it's really behooves you. You can't buy product if you don't know whether it's going to contaminate it with microbes or heavy metals or whatever the case may be. So Yeah, I mean, it really is a negotiating point, but you do have the law behind it. You can't just send it to market without testing. And depending on your state, I know some states, for example, will test for pre-rolls. It will include the paper, right? It'll include the cone. Some won't. I mean, either way, just from the standpoint of, let's just say, again, liability and ethics, you don't want to be putting into market products that will be hurting your consumers.
I mean, New York requires it to all be in final packaging before tested, which I hate personally from a logistics standpoint, because why would I spend the money on packaging if my batch didn't pass at the lab, right? That being said, it does get ahead of exactly what Suehiko's describing, right? Is that like if I bought packaging, I put it in there and it turns out my packaging contaminated all of it, well, then it's actually really good that New York kind of did it that way, right? It's saving me a recall to just know ahead of time. And to your earlier point, this is where having that vendor verification, I could immediately put my finger on the source of contamination, right? And go, guys, look, we were clean. We put it in the containers. Suddenly we're not. Again, it's financial liability. Like you're now a cost to my business, and I need, somebody that's more reliable.
Definitely. Yeah, another big one is marketing. As we go state to state, we always see marketing regulations differ wildly from state to state. Always catches people off guard. We've had regulators come back and say, you've got a you've got a sign down on the boardwalk, or on a pedicab down by the boardwalk. Well, you can't have that. And so it's important, again, going back, knowing those regulations, having the CRC, the OCM, OCR, whatever you're certifying your regulatory body is, might not have a requirement that says you need a marketing SOP, but you need a marketing SOP. You need to know those marketing regulations. That's gotten a lot of people in trouble, and then you're scrambling to get that pulled down. And where people go wrong there is the marketing companies don't know the regulations. The marketing companies, they're just good salesmen, and they're just going to tell you whatever you want to hear, that it's not a problem. And we've got vape shops marketing, all over the place, and that's fine. And yeah, that's, we see that. Sure, the hemp shop can put up the big pot leaf sign, but you can't. And that's unfortunate. And we hope to see that change. But, it's knowing having an SOP for that is very important, knowing those procedures.
Ohio was a really good example of what Beck's talking about, right? So we had worked with several dispensaries in Ohio. They charge $100 per ad submission to do a dispensary or cultivator ad. Well, if your ad is rejected, you then have to resubmit for another $100. So it's like a legitimate cost that, hey, we want to do ads. We want people to know that we're here. But at the same time, if any, and then just regulatory enforcement is all over the map. So one agent will tell you that this is wrong. Another will accept it and pass it through. And then you go to try to run the same ad 6 months later and it gets rejected. This is where keeping logs of all of the ads that you've run, why they passed, why they failed, and then also to Beck's point, an SOP of how you develop these ads and what all the regulations are, it can save you $100 in a rejection, right? So this is where just trying to think about, money saving.
I mean, having the
There's
roles and responsibilities too, like back to Suhiko's point, it seems so basic, but having one person responsible for approving those ads, that puts the burden on them. They need to know those regulations before they approve it, because
yeah.
boom, they send it off. Hey, why did you send this off? And it's not, it's not regular, it's not legal. So having that organizational chart, those roles and responsibilities, often we'll see in a dispensary, your compliance role will be your metric, or your metric person, your one guy, your inventory specialist, your inventory manager that knows metric really well, and they keep that up to snuff and check and fix those discrepancies on a daily basis. Cultivator or manufacturers will see a QA or a compliance manager position in there, and they're going to be your go-to person. They're going to make sure all of those logs are being filled out, all those everything has been sanitized. And then, if they go and they see somebody's made a batch of something and they don't have a sanitation log for that piece of equipment, well, as your compliance manager, they're going to put that product on hold and say, and until we can confirm that this product is safe, because like somebody didn't do their job. So having a compliance manager or quality manager on site to make sure that all this documentation is getting filled out is very important as well. So plan that into your organization. One person running the business cannot do everything, and they cannot check that every single log and form is being filled out. So definitely plan for that.
Yeah.
I think we should transition this to just kind of the Q&A and kind of really kind of go down some of these questions in the Q&A.
So like the first one might be a question for you, Suehiko. If your partner ghosts you and you have them on the operating agreement, what should you do? How should you go about getting them off that operating agreement, removing them
Yeah.
from the business?
Yeah. Well, a lot of that really depends on the facts and the agreement that you have. So there's various what we call the causes of action, right, that you can bring against somebody, a counterparty, an individual. And it really is very fact specific, right? So there may be provisions, there should be provisions in the agreement. And again, depending on what was already done, there can be sort of some cause of action that arise, maybe a contract. But again, it's very, very fact specific. And then to your question, I think is right. It is state dependent, right? So it really matters the state that you're in. There could be fiduciary duties that arise. But again, it's a very, very fact dependent. It could just be an abandonment, right? It depends on and I think always the question, this is what I advise, is start with what do you want the outcome to be, right? What is it you're looking to happen? And then we can sort of, work backwards from there, right? This is how you accomplish that. I hope that that's kind of a general, vague answer, but unfortunately, it's hard to answer those questions specifically.
Yeah, don't know the situation, but I guess if you're pre-licensure, that's not too big of a deal. But if you're post-licensure, it rarely happens. Usually, somebody's out there with their hand out. I want to be paid out for my share of the equity. If you're already up and running, that's an interesting one. I think we answered the supplier audit
Evan.
agreement.
Yeah. There's a good question here about payments. And without reading the bulk of it, it's basically like, why are we still stuck with no credit card payment? And why are we doing, the ATM transfer thing? It's 2026. What's the deal? So all of my clients, I tell them, no credit card payments. I do not care what the payment company is telling you. Okay. I've had it pitched to me 100 different ways. Oh, you buy an ETF or what is it? An EFT, you're right, a fungible token, and then we sell the token and it goes to crypto. It gets crazy. You can only do the ATM thing. Basically, that's a cash withdrawal to a business that usually doesn't have cannabis anywhere in the name because Visa and MasterCard are still very touchy about that. And this is really due to the federal tax issue and the Schedule 1 status. So again, if this does change to Schedule 3, maybe that will change. I could literally walk into a liquor store right now and use my credit card to buy enough booze to kill myself. So, hopefully good sense will take over in the industry for payments. But right now, only debit transaction, no credit, don't do it, don't do it.
Even the debit transactions. I mean, I see even the large MSOs that, if you go in there one week, they have a debit machine, and the next week they don't have it. It's cash only, and then the next week they got a brand new debit company they're working with, or that brand new ATM company they're working with to make those payments. So they're just leapfrog into the next person, waiting to get shut down. And it's going to change, hopefully sooner than later. But
I think, yeah, and I think it is opening, and to be clear, right? So you've got, so the question, sort of why, right? What is the hurdle? And it's multifaceted, right? So you've got the overarching federal illegality, right? And all of the compliance that comes downstream from there in finance. But then you've just got simply, MasterCard and Visa and their policies. They simply will not allow it. And so, it has to all kind of come together, which I expect, with the rescheduling, we'll see a lot of this opening up. And we are seeing, banking and all of the financial industry opening up. But again, heed what Warren and Beck are saying, still be very cautious. It is an unfortunate one of the many challenges of this industry. And we're holding our breath to see this all change, hopefully fairly rapidly with rescheduling.
I've got another
Um,
question here that's kind of a legal question. How do you recommend operators structure their relationship with legal counsel before launch so they can not scramble for advice after compliance issues arise? We
well, I
always,
suggest, oh, second.
sorry, I mean, we always recommend, we write the applications, we write all this material. We always want it to be reviewed by an attorney, by the client's attorney, and then of course structuring the operating agreement, obviously. So I'll let you speak there, Suehiko.
Yeah, so we actually at Cogent, we have a fairly bespoke business model. I think it lends itself to early stage operators where, reach out to us and we can kind of look at your specific circumstances. But we can do these on hourly. We can do this by project, or like I said, we also offer a fractional GC type of service where we're sort of on call for a suite, a scope of work pre-launch to help kind of think through these things. So a lot of different ways to handle that.
That's really good, that fractional GC, because I get very difficult questions from clients. It's usually like, "Hey, I want to do this. I don't think it's legal, but can you figure out a way to make this legal for me to do?" And it's like, guys, I mean, this is what the regulations say. If you think you've got a way around it, you really need to talk to a lawyer. But this is all I can say is this is black and white in the regulations for me. You think you've got a way around it, definitely talk to a lawyer on that, because I don't want to give you bad advice on that. So,
Just to get through Jessica's quick question about the CBD hemp dispensary, it depends on what state you're in. I will say that CBD hemp shops, it's basically a dispensary already built out. Adding, some state security requirements is great. The problem is if there's no licensing opening in your state, well, you're going to stay a hemp CBD company, right? So, really location, location, location. If you're in New Jersey, licensing is open, you could make that transition. Ohio, you could maybe make that transition. Minnesota,
Minnesota.
licensing is closed, but they just reopened for hemp CBD companies, right? So that's what you're referring to, Beck. So there could be, again, contact Suehiko at Cogent, contact Cannaspire. We'll talk about how to make that transition for you.
Yeah, there's always a license for sale too. If you wanted to go that route, it's often more expensive that way. But if you can, find somebody pre-licensed, pre-operational, like Minnesota, there are a handful of licenses for sale that would allow you to make that transition for, as little as $50,000 for a license. It was obviously cheaper if you'd gotten in on the licensing round, but there's options for you depending on what state you are.
And then I see the question about most facility owners are reactive, not proactive. Beck hit on that one really well in our conversation that we have great GMs that we put into dispensaries, great growers, and then the owner says they want to do things their own way. And it causes them to butt heads. And sometimes they even lose talented employees because the employee is trying to do things the compliant right way to be, fire preventer rather than a firefighter. And management says, "Oh no, that's a cost. We don't want to do that. We're just going to put out the fires as they pop up." Well, eventually you get burned doing it that way, right? So,
yeah,
yeah.
If you
Yeah,
don't
go ahead.
plan, yeah, I'm just going to add to that. If you don't plan, plan for your taxes, plan for your renewal fees, plan for your municipal license fees can be 20, $40,000 in New Jersey in certain municipalities. Um, scrambling to get ahead on those taxes, it's not a good way to start. So you want to be proactive and make sure that's done right and set aside. Be proactive when it comes to your regulations and your marketing, and make sure all your SOPs are really tight. And you can try to be proactive on hiring. There's always, sometimes I always feel like we're one step behind and on the hiring in some of these higher turnover dispensaries. But yeah, it's just to touch on that a little bit.
And then
I
the
think
last question, and this is a good one. I think we can give Suehiko the last word here. They're a Minnesota ancillary business. They're raising capital. What do they have to do in that process? So step one, a business plan. What is your business worth? How much money are you going to make? And that helps you value what your equity is worth, right? And then I would like to say you need to talk to Suehiko because your operating agreement and how is this a voting partner? Is this somebody that's just bringing in sweat equity? Are they paying in? All of these really matter to how you structure it. And again, what do you want out of the relationship? So I'll turn it over to you.
yeah, no, I think you hit on a lot of the considerations. Always, 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 and again, I just want to emphasize this business model, right? You got to first really be clear about what your model is, what the strategy is, the size of the market, what your product is, what are you offering? And then from there, all of it kind of is downstream. And the structuring into your question of do we offer sweat equity? Yeah, it's very, very common. In sort of the corporate structure. You can have stock options and stuff like that. There's less flexibility than in an LLC. The LLC structuring is profits interest, but similar concept, which offers and allows for sweat equity. Very important, though, that you structure that correctly because you could be, there are tax consequences if you don't. If you give somebody equity in compensation for services, they will pay ordinary income tax on that. And again, that's a hiccup I've seen happen, and you don't want to be in that position. And of course, you do also have to be aware of labor laws and minimum wage laws and things of that nature. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration. But I can't stress enough, get the business model first. Know what you're going to be actually doing, and make sure that you are confident that it's actually a viable business.
Yeah,
I've seen a
developing
lot of
good.
bad. Go ahead, Beck.
Oh, so yeah, just saying developing a good financial pro forma is probably your most valuable piece when you're raising money as well. Proving that you have a good plan, and that you know what your expenses are, and what your a reasonable projection for your profit and your sales are. You don't want to go in there saying I'm going to make $10 million a year when there's eight other dispensaries in your town, and you're probably going to do $1 million or $2 million a year. So knowing those, having the right knowledge to project those is important as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say I've seen a lot of bad agreements, right? Where people take in large investment and wind up becoming an employee of their own entity. So protect yourself, talk to a lawyer first, understand what you really need to give away, and to Beck's point, what the revenue is and what your real world value is for your business. Don't overproject trying to get money in. That's dangerous because then you wind up giving up more shares, right? So.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is all of our questions. We really appreciate everybody joining us today, and please reach out to us at Cogent or at Cannaspire, and we'd love to have a one-on-one discussion with you, and talk about your business and your goals, and see how we can work together.
Thank you all.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your time, everyone.